Right to Reason podcast. I am your host, Robert Stanley. Which has the superior case for morality, Christianity or secularism? Today, two Christians and two atheists intend to argue why they think they hold the better claim.
It's the Right to Reason podcast.
I'm saying if there is no such thing as goodness known as God's nature, then every thought I have about morality is just an opinion, because there is no objective morality for me to appeal to see if my opinion lines up with His nature.
My view is that morality, our human morality, is older than religion. So instead of saying morality comes from God or religion gave us morality, for me that's a big no-no. Our current religions are just 2,000 or 3,000 years old, which is very young. And our species is much older, and I cannot imagine that, for example, 100,000 years or 200,000 years, our ancestors did not have some type of morality. Of course, they had rules about how you should behave, what is fair, what is unfair, caring for others. All of these tendencies were in place already, so they had a moral system. And then at some point we developed these present-day religions, which I think were sort of tacked onto the morality that we had.
What is meaning and purpose in my life? It is to bring glory and honor to God. He does that through me establishing first this overarching objective of live my life in a way that is pleasing to Him, which has a moral basis grounded in the Word of God.
Let me go.
Oh, well, this is a good reason for me to not rape and kill because God says so. That's very dangerous, because sometimes God does say to kill, and He does say to take the women of your enemies as your prisoners, and as long as they haven't known a man.
God's ways are not our ways. His plans aren't our plans. We don't think like He does, but He has still established a moral law.
The secular approach, when applied to medicine, cures diseases. When applied with geometry and engineering, it creates buildings, it creates cars, it does things, it has inherent value.
And I cried out, Jesus, forgive me. And in that moment, I felt the nail print in His wrist rise up in the palm of my hand. And He says, but Nick, I love you that much.
I had a very similar experience. I have had visions of Jesus.
I had a near-death experience. It allows me to be the best person that I can be.
It absolutely has to come from God, because there has to be an absolute truth for anything to make sense.
Without the presence of God, love falls apart. If this was some sort of revelation, shouldn't it be constant and not in flux and not situational?
God is never changing.
This episode of the Right to Reason podcast is brought to you by our patrons and contributors like me. We have all recognized the value of the unrestrained marketplace of ideas and have decided to make a difference. You can make a difference too. Contribute at patreon.com/right and learn more about your right to reason at therighttoreason.com. Your activism is appreciated.
And today we're talking to Seamus from the Free Thought Prophet. You can find the Free Thought Prophet all over YouTube or your podcasting outlets. Seamus, happy to have you back, brother.
Same here. Thanks for having me on.
Always, man. And also we're joined with Nick McClellan.
Hello.
Nick's work can be found on afterhoursproduction.com. He's a Sunday school teacher. We're also joined with Alex Moreschi. Alex, happy to have you back, man.
Super stoked to be here.
Alex is a hospice chaplain, and he's ordained in the Episcopal Church. We're also joined here with Josh, my good buddy Josh. How you been?
I've been great, man. How about yourself?
Okay. The corona thing's kind of screwing up my graduation plans. I'm kind of bummed about it. I wanted one of the kids to see me graduating, but I'm all right.
That's a pisser.
It's not worth bitching about. But Josh is a secular chaplain and a former minister. So we got two Christians here, a lot of philosophy degrees in this group as well. And we also have two atheists. I was hoping that you guys could discuss which is better, secular morality or Christian morality. I thought this might be an appropriate place to start with this clip about Nietzsche and his views on God is dead.
Nietzsche's dramatic assertion that God is dead is not, as it's often taken to be, some kind of a celebratory statement. Despite his reservations about Christianity, Nietzsche didn't think that the end of belief was anything to cheer about. Religious beliefs were false, he knew, but he observed that they were very, very beneficial. He believed the universities were killing the humanities, turning them into dry academic exercises, rather than using them for what they were always meant to be, guides to life. He called for a reformation in which people, newly conscious of the crisis brought on by the end of faith, would fill the gaps created by the disappearance of religion with philosophy and art. For Nietzsche, the 19th century was reeling under the impact of two developments, mass democracy and atheism. The first threatened to unleash torrents of undigested envy, the second to leave humans without guidance or morality.
You know, I can tell you he's not wrong about there being some issues with democracy. Democratic peace theory states that it's not only that we're less likely to attack a fellow democracy, but we are therefore more likely to attack a country that's not democratic. And, you know, that kind of breeds a little bit of nationalism, and we're seeing a lot of that going on right now. Josh, you're kind of a Nietzsche nut. Would that be a fair characterization of you? Do you agree?
Not entirely. I mean, okay. you get two philosophers in a room and you have like 3 or 4 opinions, right? So I'm going to have to say that while Nietzsche is certainly an inspired author, there is a lot to be desired in the way of analytical philosophy there. So let's dig into this. First off, by saying God is dead, that's a powerful metaphor. You kind of reify the God idea there. Oh, well, God must have existed and then he died. And that's not exactly what it's meant. But I'm going to go ahead and say that as far as ethics are concerned, and a question of religion and secularism, I'm going to lean a little bit more on someone like Aristotle. Only because there's something more there that is a little bit more objective there. Aristotle did believe in objective ethics. And I think Nietzsche was also painfully aware that it's a painfully subjective subject as well. And so without going too far down this path here, I do love the inspiration of Nietzsche. And I certainly agree with him about the importance of atheism. He also said a lot of crazy shit too. He says the only worthy person of admiration in the whole New Testament is Pilate for having the good sense to kill Christ. Wow. He likes to say things to get attention, and he likes to provoke his readers. So I wouldn't even sit there too much in the morality conversation. I'm afraid I might be kind of boring and disappoint you and say that someone like Aristotle might be a much better place to kind of start as far as contrasting the religious basis for morality versus the secular one.
You know, I think Nick and Alex would probably agree with you, because a lot of what I hear from modern Christianity is a kind of a return to the Aristotle virtue ethics. Is that a fair characterization of how you guys view philosophy?
To a certain extent, yeah.
I think he's right in terms of, I mean, Aristotle is certainly where I go back to with virtue ethics very, very often. I do not think that modern day Christianity follows that. In general, I think that they've gone away from. I mean, in terms of Christian terms, what we would be better talking about would be Thomas Aquinas, right? Who really took Aristotle and molded it to fit a Christian worldview and ethic. And I don't think that most Christians in the United States necessarily know who Thomas Aquinas even was. So
you guys are talking way over my head. This is Nick, and I look at the conversation as a direction of saying, why do we have morals? And whose morals are right. And so I don't study Nietzsche. I don't study these other guys that you're talking to as far as philosopher goes. So I'm the guy that's in South Georgia living his life among a primarily Christian environment. I share my gospel regularly with individuals that I come across. And so this is the question, you know, where does morality come from? And my suggestion is that morality comes from God. The argument is always that morality comes from one person looking after another, but there has to be a moral basis for the beginning and the establishment of morality.
Well, so before that, I think you know, you have to define morality here. What do you mean by, like, the philosopher in me is just sort of saying, what do you mean by morality?
Okay, so I would say like objective morality would be like right or good values that are true and binding. Maybe regardless of an opinion, such as, like gravity. You can say, well, I don't believe in gravity, but that doesn't change the fact that there is gravity. So these are things that would have, it's an action that has a basis that is not bound on opinion. It's a statement of fact, you know. So we can get really deep in the weeds here trying to explain what I mean by that. But I think that would be somewhat of a definition. I would say it's a right or a good value that is true regardless of opinions.
Where do these kind of values exist? So is it like, are they like some sort of like metaphysical law out there? You know, like rape is bad, murder is bad.
Well, I've asked the question before of many people that I stand in front of, and we have conversations not unlike this. And I ask the question: when you do something wrong, do you know it? Is there something within you that resonates? And I'm saying, even if you are out in the woods all by yourself, nobody sees what you're doing, there's no accountability on any shape, form, or fashion, and you do something that you sense within yourself that this is not right. Where does that come from?
But it's not the same for everybody.
Yeah,
exactly.
And those things kind of change over. Those things definitely change over time. Yeah, I mean, those kind of values, I would argue. I think that's a deeply subjective thing, and also I think what you're telling me, what I hear, to be fair and correct me if I'm wrong, is this is kind of a top-down thing. If there is God, and God tells us what is right, God establishes what is right, that is a very top-down kind of ethic system. Whereas I happen to think that it's a bottom-up kind of thing. It's a bubbling up, and it comes from that kind of groundscape. But like all of this time of existing, and we've arrived at these values, and they've changed over time, which can be kind of infuriating because there is a degree of, I hate to say the word relativity, but there is a sense of change there. It's a little bit more fast and loose than what we might be comfortable with, in just strict Western thinking.
Mm-hmm. Well, I get what you're saying, but I'm saying that I believe that there are moral absolutes. So maybe I should be more specific in what I'm saying, is that I think there are moral absolutes that define. It's when you play a game, there are rules. The rules aren't supposed to change in the way you play the game. And so
Depends on the game.
Oh, that's true. That's true. But I'm saying in the game of life, the morals, the purpose, the meaning, the specificity that God has placed us on this planet to accomplish must be played within the guidelines of what is defined. It's just like, the only example I can think of is like in a baseball game. You have the commissioner who establishes what the rules are. The umpire then officiates the game. Each player on the field doesn't have the right to say, well, I don't like that rule, I'm not going to play by that. If I want to walk to first and be safe, even if he throws me out, that's the way I'm playing the game. There has to be an overarching theme to the game for there to be any continuity of it. And I say, from a Christian perspective, God establishes that.
Again, that's an argument from authority, though, right? I mean, that's what
I don't know. It's not an argument from authority necessarily, right? This follows that Aristotelian line of thinking that we were just talking about a minute ago. Although it would be more sort of that Kantian, Immanuel Kant, like categorical imperatives, right? There is a Christian alternative. The Christian alternative is situational ethics. It's Reinhold Niebuhr, H. Richard Niebuhr, these kinds of guys. So my question, my point here, or my pushback on that would be the rules of the game of baseball are only the rules of the game of baseball because we agree that those are the rules in the game of baseball. If half the players on the field didn't agree that those were the rules going into the game, then it would be chaos, right?
But it wouldn't change the rules of the game. It would only change the opinions of the players in the game, and that's
sure it would though. Sure, it would though. It would.
You could piggyback on that. You can piggyback on that as far as what you're saying. As far as the game, it could be because changing it because of necessity, right? I mean, how many of us played, backyard football or baseball or whatever? You might have to adjust the game. You might have to say, oh, we only have 2 outs because, we only have 1 ball and we lose the ball. We have these issues, right? The environment might, or this, the needs of completing the game and a time or other governance might play more upon the role of what the actual rules are, right, than any one authority.
Right. I would agree. And I want to try to now steer the conversation based on exactly what you've said, because more or less what you're creating in that thought process, if I understand you correctly, is like a situational ethics. So the rules are this, if this is the definition of the game. But if we're going to play this game elsewhere, then the rules are going to change. I'm saying that when you look at the top-down approach, God establishes the rules and we are to play within them. See, I believe in you reap what you sow. You sow discord, you reap discord. You sow goodness, you reap goodness. And so if we're playing the rules of the game where it's constantly changing, but you are going against the moral established laws that God has, there are consequences for changing those rules. And so
what evidence do you have for that?
What evidence do I have for that? Well, you guys are probably going to disagree with this statement, but I'm going to say it. In the marriage of a man and a woman, the normalcy of that breeds healthy family environment. When you put men and men and women and women, it wasn't designed to work that way. Therefore, there's not the healthy environment. Now, you can say
but statistically, that's not backed up.
Yeah.
Right. When you look at the actual figures and the data, that's not true at all.
But you have to say who's interpreting the data and who's giving the data. I mean, if I'm in an unhealthy relationship and you ask me the question, it depends on how you ask the question as to whether I'm going to give you the answer I think you want or a truthful answer. So polls can be skewed.
Yeah, but now you're creating an unfalsifiable claim, and that's not helpful, right?
Well, right.
The data shows very, very clearly that things like spousal abuse, the length of the union, those sorts of things are actually significantly higher. Spousal abuse is much higher in heterosexual relationships. The length of relationship is often very much higher in homosexual relationships. I mean, these are figures that you really can't do a whole lot of skewing with. So I guess what I'm saying is that you're making a claim without putting the evidence to back up that.
I agree, and I'll argue that fact all the time. But I also know that if you watch a Republican television show versus a Democratic television show, they're talking about the same topics, and they come up with two totally different results, each of them posting polls. So it's kind of like science. Science merely makes a statement, but it is the scientists that interpret the statement. So I'm saying the same thing is true about any of these polls, is that there's the interpretation of the person reading the data. And if I believe a certain way, when I look at that data, I'm going to respond it in a favorable way to my way of looking at it. And most people do that because science doesn't say anything. Scientists do.
Well, no, I mean, I don't know. I don't know that that's entirely accurate either, though. I mean, I've been in a lab. I've done, scientific research. I've been a part, yes, there is a degree to which you can modify numbers and those sorts of things. But I guess, so here's my question in terms of the claim regarding marriage and relationships, right? Is there any evidence that would change your mind on that front?
Changing my mind as in that the marriage is between one man and one woman? Procreation is the main point.
No, hang on. That marriage between one man and one woman is superior. I mean, that was the case you were making, is that it is superior, and saying that the other unions don't work was what you said. Is there any evidence that could be provided that would change your mind on that?
I will state it this way. I am not saying that you couldn't provide evidence that might make a case for the fact that those two are potentially equal as far as longevity. You might even make the case to say, well, the two gay couples are happier or are happy. But from my perspective, the difference of the morality of is it right or wrong would be unchangeable. So from one perspective in your question, yes, you might be able to prove that, these 6 couples that are gay claim to be happy and these 6 people over here claim to be miserable. And so you could say from that statement, this is right and that is wrong. Yes, you might make that statement, but would I say it's morally right? I think that's a different conversation, a different argument. So I would say, no, it's not morally right based on the tenet of the 10 Commandments. But I would say, yes, you can make that argument.
10 Commandments?
Well, not the 10 Commandments on marriage. That's not one of the 10 Commandments. Other than thou shalt not have adultery. Well, you don't have adultery.
So I want to jump in and I'm already having several problems, but I don't want to follow every single rabbit hole. Let's take a step back. And if you don't know the Euthyphro dilemma, then I will give this to you. I'm not intending to spring some sort of trap on you, but let's look at this. The Christianity is a religion of revelation. God reveals things to Moses. He reveals he reveals to Moses that you take a life for a life. Then Jesus comes along and reveals, forgive each other. Don't do an eye for an eye and tooth for tooth, life for life anymore. And the rules change a little bit. No longer is it, hey, don't rape that girl. It's don't even look at her with lust in your heart. You've already done the deed. These kind of revelations, things that God say are good, are they good because God says they're good? Or are they good because God is omniscient and his all-knowingness allows him to say, oh yeah, that's good. So whether it's marriage between a woman and a man, and that old traditional line, or something like, hey, maybe don't rape. Is that really the heuristic you want to stand on? I'm thinking if this conversation is about secular versus religion, in terms of like bases for morality, I think a much better heuristic, and even one that is flawed but still much better, would be suffering. God saying, hey, well, don't rape because I say don't rape. That doesn't do much. That's just, oh, hey, believe me, I know what I'm talking about. Well, how do you know that? I think you can get a whole lot further without even getting too far into the ontological weeds by saying, okay, well, my ethics can have one anchor that is, look at the amount of suffering a particular action gives and let that be a good guide. Just that, again, and there are flaws with that. I'll readily admit that. But I think that's one hell of a better anchor than, oh, well, this unseen voice in the sky through this old book that has several huge problems historically is something that we should take as some sort of guide. The Bible can't even agree on what day Jesus died on, much less his core message. I think that there's some serious problems even relying on the Bible. But as far as the religion science debate, why don't we just talk a little bit about that? Like, let's say God is something good because he says it's good, or does there an omniscient thing, or is there something outside of those two horns? How does he establish what's right?
Alex, you want to take a stab at it?
I think if I remember, this was something that Leibniz talked a lot. I did senior stuff on Leibniz, but I think at the end, it is, from a Christian perspective, the one that I would put forward in line with that situational ethics approach would be that God wills for love and harmony, and to some degree a decrease in suffering, but I think in a sort of a process oriented thing, in that sometimes we suffer and that allows us to grow, and so meaningless suffering, right? And so I think we build our morality around that, not based on deontological sort of view that there are these set rules in place. That's my opinion, but
yeah. And so what I'm asking is, if it's good just because God says so, that's really weak, especially given the source material you're working with. I mean, that can't not be addressed. That,
I agree.
And so, and also just one other point, I know that there are Christian responses to why God allows suffering, but I just mean like as a heuristic, saying, oh, well, this particular decision, even if it is selfish, and if there's a certain amount of selfishness that's okay on the secular view, that's a modifier of my behavior. For instance, I don't turn up my guitars and synthesizers too loud because I have neighbors. I have pretty good walls that kill a lot of that sound, but there's a certain point I don't go just because I don't want to bother them. That modifies my behavior. There's nothing inherently wrong about loud music, but disturbing someone else's day. And that scales all the way up from minor things like just living in the same like apartment complex to, well, I'm not going to harm somebody with no good reason because it would cause a lot of suffering. And not that anyone in this conversation says that, but startlingly a lot, the Christian line is, oh, well, what keeps you from raping and murdering? I just don't want to.
See, I would look at the big overarch of that is love your neighbor as yourself. So what you just described is, if I'm in my neighbor's position and I've worked and I'm trying to go to sleep, or I'm trying to just have a conversation with my spouse, and you're over there, jamming in your studio, then all of a sudden you've interrupted me. So I put myself in that person's position. But that is what I'm talking about. That's an overarching standard, to love your neighbor as yourself. I think the morality that comes out of that is we are loving because we can put ourselves in that position. But the overarching is God established that we should love our neighbor as ourselves. So that's kind of the bigger picture of this. And, you use a lot of words that I am ignorant to be able to understand. I think
forgive me.
That's all right. The heuristic side of that is learning from our mistakes. I think that is exactly where suffering comes in often occasions. Some of the greatest lessons that I've learned in my life have come from the most devastating of circumstances, where I utterly have cried out to God, I don't understand. Why is this happening? What am I to learn from it? And then years later, I look back on that situation and I recognize what God was doing in my character that I would not have turned loose of under any other circumstances other than he break it out of my hand. But I look at it from the character of the person that I am now has radically changed because of the suffering that I went through back then. So, there's a whole nother dynamic in why things happen. I think I look at the biblical principle of all things work together for good to them that are loved and called according to his purpose. So if I am his child, he desires the best for me. Even when I'm in suffering, there's something good that comes out of it.
Yeah, but God didn't always, your Christian God at least didn't always feel that way, and he definitely didn't invent the golden rule. I mean, that's something that goes back long before the Bible, even, obviously before Christ,
Yeah. Well, God was with Adam in the Garden of Eden, so there was this inherent law that was there.
Again, your assertion, right? You have to believe the Christian dogma to buy that. And As far as suffering, I mean, in fact, did not God require suffering? I mean, the whole point of Jesus was that he had to suffer on the cross for you. I mean, he definitely enjoys a lot of the suffering. And like I said about him changing his mind, he definitely didn't give any cares about how the neighbors suffered whenever he instructed people to go and genocide and enslave people. And, all throughout the Old Testament, I mean, Joshua was pretty down for all that stuff. So was David.
Mm-hmm. So the Christ question, just to jump in for a second, I mean, that is what is called Christology, is that, that suffering was necessary from a top-down sense. There are other theologians, and there are other, I think, the history of thought and schools of thought that talk about more of what's called Christus exemplar. In other words, that Christ served as the example, and in living the life that loved God and loved the neighbor, that the logical end of that life is a retaliation by society, by those in a position of power. So those that are martyred after professing, and working towards radical love, such as Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela is arrested. There are lots of examples of this, both in sort of a Christian worldview and outside of that. The point wasn't the suffering, but that suffering and ultimately death is the logical end of a godly life, because it goes against the status quo and the people with power.
That's a weird way to show love for your subjects, to have a suffering end for them.
There's plenty of evil people that have been martyred as well, so that doesn't really, wash either.
And evil people who turn out sorry about that. I'm just evil people who prosper, right?
Yes.
Sure.
I mean, even
how
the
does
Bible
that speak against what I'm talking about? I'm confused.
Okay, so for myself, I keep coming back to this, like the rubbing against of religious-based morality and secular-based morality. And so where I'm going is I already just see from the get-go serious problems with, especially in terms of Christianity, any morality that is built on that.
What are the problems? I guess would be my question. So what I'm pointing to, yes, it is problematic to talk about ethics from a deontological standpoint. That is, that top-down, God-ordained, these rules out in existence, that exist outside of the context of people's lives. What I'm suggesting and offering is that there is a valid Christian tradition and schools of thought that take a situational ethics approach that are not in line with that, but still do use a lot of the foundations of Christianity to aid them in the process of that moral thinking.
Well, doesn't that kind of reveal that it's not revelation, that it has been an evolution of situational ethics itself instead of, dogma based or issued by some sort of deity? I mean, the fact of the change in laws, or, alleged changing in laws, because that's another argument between the Old and New Testament. The fact that you even, one of you, and I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth, and you can straighten me out by all means, pointed to Thomas Aquinas as in, like, some of the views that he had towards modern Christianity has kind of shifted the thoughts of some. If this was some sort of revelation, shouldn't it be constant and not in flux and not situational?
God is never changing. His ways are always established. So I think from the moral standpoint of view, the overarching large-scale top-down approach is God's ways are not our ways. His plans aren't our plans. We don't think like he does, but he has still established a moral law. So if you want to argue the point, what moral law do you think God has created that you don't see manifesting itself in the way we live our lives?
Yeah, I mean, I was simply, with Thomas Aquinas, what I was talking about, I was the one that mentioned, I was connecting that to Aristotle. So I was saying that in terms of Christian ethics, Thomas Aquinas uses Aristotle in his foundations of theology and ethical behavior and thinking. That's what I was saying, and I was saying that's sort of the Christian adaptation to that. But from my perspective, right, it's not problematic that these things change because society changes, people change, the world changes, it evolves. So for me, that doesn't lessen. I think what you were doing was saying that that's an argument against Christianity itself rather than against Christian ethics. And I think that you're presupposing that that's a problem.
If your whole basis is Christianity is the basis for morality, then I would think so.
I didn't say that Christianity was the basis for morality, but I did say that I do think that there is a valid Christian moral ethic.
So I want to jump in here. It's something totally random, but yet very much on point. So Robert has heard my testimony before, so I think it's very relevant that I share a portion of it at this point because it makes the point that I can't make as a philosopher because I'm not one. So being a Sunday school teacher for 30 years, at 48 years of age, well established in business, things were going great for me. I came to a crisis of belief where I said, I read things in the Bible, they're either true or they're not true. I want to know. And I came to a place of surrender where I said, God, I want all that you have. I hold nothing back. I give you everything within me. I want to know you more. And in that moment, I went into a vision, which I'd never had before. And I reached up and touched Jesus's hands. It felt initially as though I was just reaching my hands up in the air. But in the midst of that, I grabbed Jesus in an Indian grip, and I touched his hand in a physical sense in this vision, and I felt the condemnation of all of my sins. Now, I want to state it from this perspective because I think it's super important to what we're saying here. Morally, there's probably not one of you that would have looked at my life and said there's anything wrong with anything that you're doing, because I didn't have any objective, consistent sin in my life other than maybe attitudes that anyone in the world would have looked at and said, he's a good guy. But when I touched the perfection of God, I was immediately aware that my morality did not stand up to his overarching moral law. And I cried out, Jesus, forgive me. And in that moment, I felt the nail print in his wrist rise up in the palm of my hand. And he says, but Nick, I love you that much. And I went from feeling immense condemnation to a manner of love that I had never experienced. And I have 3 children, and I love each of my 3 children more and more and more. So my capacity to love has increased with each child. But to understand what God's love for me was radically changed my thought life on morality at large, because I was judging morality based on me against other people. Now, all of a sudden, I saw God for who he was, and his judgment of morality is so much greater than mine. That's why God, when Jesus had the conversation with the rich young ruler, he said, what must I do to be saved? And he said, go and sell all you had. And he said he went away sad because Jesus had said, why do you call me good? There is none good but one. Good means moral perfection. God is the only one that has moral perfection. Right. So he's the only one can set the law.
Right. So all of that is fine. But I think the problem is that first off, that's super anecdotal, right? That's super like from a single individual in a place and time with a background's perspective. You know, whenever you're trying to do one person's experience and make that and broaden that to be a universal claim, that's super problematic. This is why we have things like peer review in science, right? It's not just one scientist doing a test. It's 50 scientists doing 50 tests at different times all around the world.
But how many Christians are there in the world? How many Christians are there? So that's not anecdotal to one person.
No, it is anecdotal. That particular story is anecdotal to one person.
Yes, but I'm saying
that's what I'm getting at. But if you make that argument, I mean, there are lots of Muslims in the world. There are lots of, I mean, that that's an anecdotal argument that I don't think it's fine if that's what allowed you to change some things about you and sort of live a better life for your perspective. Like that's wonderful. That's fine. But I have a serious, and I'm guessing the other few guys on here have serious issues with taking that and making that into a universal ethic.
First off, that took me back hearing that, because I had a very similar experience. I have had visions of Jesus, and they were moving. They made me feel more elated than the most pure MDMA, and I had visions that were more lucid than some of the best hallucinogens money can buy. And those were powerful experiences in my youth. And not only does that happen in a lot of faith traditions, there's a wealth of information about this in psychology. I also have a similar experience of seeking and then not finding. And that is just as valid for me to stand on, finding that the Gospels are not valid, that if Paul says, if Jesus is not risen, our Gospel's null and void, me finding the Gospel to be null and void, this conversation being about morality and what do you, and I can't help but use the bottom up language, saying, what do you place that on? What do you build that from? I'm going to go ahead and say that personal experience does not do a whole lot for me or anyone else. It might for you on a subjective level, and frankly, that's a beautiful thing. I really don't want to discount the beauty and inspiration of that in a certain sense. But as far as how you're supposed to comport yourself and treat your fellow human beings and even treat yourself, that hasn't moved the conversation forward at all.
Well, it would move the conversation forward if you saw the result of the impact of that as me becoming a better father, becoming a better husband, the moral standards of me impacting other people. To me, it brought the Bible to life, because what was happening was I read about it but had never experienced
and again, that's the thing, though, is that, like, I grant that. I take that for granted, right? I accept that part of what you're saying and that part of the proposition. What I'm rejecting is that has any standing or relevance to a broader conversation about morality and ethics from a metaphysical or philosophical standpoint.
Well, when you read something, you can take it as, I read this, but I don't know that that's true or not. But then when you read it and you experience it, then it validates it, because now you emotionally have experienced what you psychologically understood, but it makes sense. So it becomes truth to you because you thought it, then it became real when it acted itself out in whatever manner. And so therefore, that's how truth is formulated in that. And for me, when it validated Scripture, that validated Scripture for me in a way that made it more real, more tangible, which gave validity to other things that Scripture would say, that just broadened the scope of my understanding of God's love for me.
But everybody in this room could have the same experience and go away from a different direction, right?
That's
There's
true.
no guarantee that that's what is actually happening. I had a near-death experience, and I don't want to get into the whole story because I've done it 1,000 times, and nor do I want to monopolize this conversation. But I was very much a fundamentalist at the time, and the lack thereof of any sort of caring or vision of God or comfort of God, or even the lack of pitchforks and open flames definitely spent my world into questioning and looking things objectively. That was my way of coming out of it. Mm-hmm. So, if you had that same experience, maybe you wouldn't. Maybe you're thinking, oh, you know what? Maybe this was God's way of telling me that I'm morally inept and I need to be, I need to try to change my ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
That could be the answer that you're already saying, because we already have that cognitive bias that's going to shape our thoughts, right?
True.
Would that be the answer to that? I mean, I don't know. Again,
yeah.
The problem is whenever we just share experiences, they, like Josh said, that it's anecdotal. I mean, shouldn't we all, if God loves us all, be worthy of a road to Damascus experience?
I would love to have that for everybody. Yeah, I would.
I mean,
and I
I'm
don't
just
understand
saying.
why it doesn't. No, but I agree with you. For me, I would love to see everybody experience God in a real and a tangible way, because it would radically change all of us. You can't experience God and it not impact your life. So yes, I understand what you're saying. Why doesn't he reveal himself to everybody like that? Why did he do that for me? And why was I 48? And, so there's a lot of why questions. But, back to the morality.
It's very telling that we all don't have experiences like that. I hope you gentlemen, seem great. I'm a little, perhaps it's just me. I don't consider myself a terribly smart person. I feel like we're not really doing much here in terms of what's a better reason for being moral. I want to offer a thought, and then we can go back around. But I think that the secular response is that it actually offers you something. The religious, what I keep hearing from one side is that, you'll get validation and God experiences. But here's a good reason to be moral, is that it will make your life better. It is worth doing on its own. The secular approach, when applied to medicine, cures diseases. When applied with geometry and engineering, it creates buildings, it creates cars, it does things, it has inherent value. By having a secular ethic, I honestly think, and starting with Aristotle, even though there are flaws there, you can move on up to, okay, we can build better people, better societies, better politics, a better life, a better quality of life. And I don't see any of that in the religious thing. I see dogmatism, I see authority, and frankly, resting any of that on the Bible without first addressing some problems like even just Christianity, just the Gospels alone. They're not written by people who we know, not eyewitnesses. They're dated way later than we would be comfortable with. Mark at 70, Luke at 85. They're not written by the people they say they're written by. They have all of these theological biases. They don't agree with each other. They're inconsistent. They're inconsistent with known facts. They testify to events that are just unlikely in the extreme. And you're saying, oh, well, this is a good reason for me to not rape and kill because God says so. That's very dangerous, because sometimes God does say to kill, and he does say to take the women of your enemies as your prisoners, and as long as they haven't known a man. And I'm not hearing one lick of what's a good reason, or what does the religious argument have going for it that secularism does not already. Like I want to get into that.
Here's one. Yeah, no, that's fair. And to be clear, I think when you're saying that you see dogmatism and all of that, I think it really depends on what vein of religion you're looking at. I really do. I think that is a lot of it, but I don't think that's it in its entirety. It's certainly not the tradition that I have been raised in. I mean, I was not raised in fundamentalism, but yet still here I am. I was raised in a very liberal household and did not have that kind of experience, and all of that. One thing that I've thought about in terms of this, and this goes back to Nietzsche, and I do think that this speaks to, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, one of his fears was that when you have a leader that no longer fears or has in the context of a higher power, that they are subject to basically doing that ethics is whatever I want it to be. And I think just look at who's in the White House right now. You take someone like Trump, who flicks his nose at religion and all of that. And I'm not using that as a sort of anecdotal evidence. I'm more pointing to that as an archetype. I'm saying that is a potential problem. And that, I think that's what Nietzsche was pointing to in that statement about God being dead, saying that it is problematic when our leaders don't feel as though they have a higher power to answer to.
But I would also posit that higher power they should answer to should be us, the people that they are supposed to be leading. That's the way that relationship ought to work. What I want to ask again is, what does religion have going for it? Like, why? I mean, why even bother in the first place? I get the liberal approach. I went from hardcore Baptist to Methodism on my way out the door, religiously speaking. But man, I really wonder, like, what does God have going for him? I mean, and really, what we're all kind of left with is the Bible. That's the primary text here. you've got this Old Testament God who says, go ahead and kill the Amalekites. There are women, men, children, babies at their mother's breast, camels, donkeys, asses, everything, kill them. And then he's mad a couple of verses later, they didn't kill them all. That's really hard in the first place, just buying that, oh, this story is even valid. But let's say that it is. Tentatively, although I can't quite go there, what does that have going for it any better than a good basis for morality can be results, just the value of living well, treating yourself well, treating others well? How is that any better than starting there, saying, hey, I want to live well, I want to flourish, I want others to flourish, I want to be decent as I can and minimize suffering? How is that any better?
So the question about whether or not there's a point to religion or to Christianity at all, I think is a different question from whether or not there is a valid morality argument to be made under Christian thought. For my part, and there's a much, I think, longer answer to this, but for my part, the short answer is that because this is the tradition that I continue to be in, because it reflects the way that I have experienced the world. It allows me to be the best person that I can be. And it allows me to do the things that I do every day. It gives me hope. It gives me the ability to reflect, and because I see meaning in the narrative and in the way that this tradition has been painted and illustrated. That is all to say, that works for me. And as Robert knows, I am not in the business of conversion. I am in the business of experiencing life as best I can to the fullest that I can. And this tradition allows me to do just that. So that is a personal answer to your question, not a rational one. But from my perspective, it's okay that it doesn't work for you. Like, that's your experience and your journey. And so these questions about morality, for me, this idea of loving my neighbor and this conversation about God moving in and out of these ethical situations, I can do the philosophical work, but on the ground level, that's what helps me to get up in the morning and to continue to do the things, not because I don't love my neighbor because I'm told to, but I do love my neighbor in the spirit of seeing the face of Christ in the other. That allows and aids me in my moral capacity. So I don't know if that answers your question at all, but that's kind of my thoughts on that matter.
I think it does, in a very powerful way. And at the risk of talking too much, I'll just be brief in saying I think a lot of that, even on my part, is valid, because you're drawing a deeply subjective. I mean, I see a lot of Kierkegaard in that. There's a subjective response. Kant. Yeah. Well, I'm not a fan of Kant though. But as far, I'll go with you on the Kierkegaard stuff. But yeah, and I'm willing to say, God, and even myself, there are parts like John, the story, and I think John 8, the woman caught in adultery, like that's not original to the Gospel of John, but man, what a beautiful story. It's one of my favorites. And I would say a lot of the issues that I brought up were probably aimed more at Nick than yourself. I mean, you had a great response. And I think one that's very, very valid. You're totally welcome to say, this is something that I find powerful and meaningful, and I incorporate it into my life. I mean, we do that with art, right? We do that with, I do that with Star Wars a little bit. Yeah. And that's not a dig at you. We do that with stories that move us. I'm a huge fan of Greek stories. The Odyssey, the Iliad, the Oresteia move me. So no, I think a lot of that is a perfectly fine response. But some of that was aimed, definitely some of those points were aimed more at Nick as a more conservative.
Right. And the last thing that I'll say before letting Nick respond, because I think his perspective is important, is that my challenge back to you and to I have a lot of atheist friends. I run in a lot of atheist circles. My challenge back is to be very careful about making both religion, Christianity, and Christians, the people, a monolith, right? Be careful about saying there is no point to religion when really what you might be talking about is there's no point to fundamentalism. right? Be careful that you're challenging the thing that you're actually challenging. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
I have been enlightened to my need and necessity to become literate in a lot of things that you guys talk about that went way over my head. So kudos to your intelligences. You're very smart. I look at it from a very simplistic view, and I believe the Bible to say, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by me. That being an arch in my life that says, why am I here? What is meaning and purpose in my life? It is to bring glory and honor to God. He does that through me establishing first this overarching objective of live my life in a way that is pleasing to him, which has a moral basis grounded in the Word of God. So his death, burial, and resurrection all come down to the fact that he loved me and was willing to suffer and sacrifice his life for my life. Am I not willing to live my life for him? So there's a whole lot of package in that creates the me that loves him, that loves my neighbor, that makes my life a living sacrifice for others, to serve others, and to do the things that I do. When I work in the homeless shelter, when I work with the poor, when I give money to things and organizations, and I travel internationally and do mission trips, it's because he first loved me. I am able to love him. So having experienced his love, it causes me to want to serve him, to want to be obedient to his commands. So where we're talking on this philosophical level, I'm talking about boots on the ground. I've experienced his love. It changed my life. It makes me want to please him. And the words of that book mean something to me when I read them.
Okay. I tend to still stick that Josh put the best question forward, and it really hasn't been answered. I think, and I'm not. I guess I'll be taking shots at both of you guys, but don't take it personal. Alex, I like a lot of the things that you said, and I agree with a lot of things, but I mean, when it comes down to it, you're talking about tradition versus religion, I guess, is how I'm kind of hearing what you're saying, because you still kind of have to cherry pick parts of the Bible for your own purpose, I would say. I mean, to me, you sound a lot like like Jefferson's Bible, if you will, right?
Yeah, you're making an assumption there, but
yeah, that's fair. I mean, that's just what I'm hearing in a lot of things that you're saying. I mean, it sounds like a lot of people that aren't practicing Jews but still have the cultural Judaism, right? Is that a fair analogy to what you were trying to put forth?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Because for me, it is a practice of faith. So it's not merely a cultural thing. It's not merely I'm not merely making a cultural argument. I am making an argument of a practice of faith. But in terms of the cherry picking comment, that's founded on the idea that, again, that the understanding of the Bible is a monolith. And I don't think it is. So it's not a matter of cherry picking. It's a matter of reading it in context.
Right. So I guess that's my still fundamental views that I was ingrained in, right?
Yeah.
That's a lot of how I still view the Bible.
Yeah.
As opposed
and
to
that was my challenge back.
Okay, I got you. So again, I think me and you're going to just have to. I think it is, or at least it is proposed to be as such, and we can get into the scriptural arguments, but that's a whole other can of worms. I don't think that we need to hit here. I again, just to kind of reiterate what Josh already put forth, that whenever you're carrying the Bible or Christianity itself as the all and be all to morality, you kind of also have to carry all the baggage that goes with it. There's a lot of calls for violence, a lot of calls for hate, even post the Old Testament. So
yeah,
I don't know. I don't know how you can rationalize that as being the still overall arcing source of any kind of true morality that we need to adhere to going forward. I still think that a less dogmatic approach to morality is the best way to go going forward. And I think that's why secularism is far better than any religious vision or standard or gauntlet tossing for morality.
Joshua Richards, Seamus, Nick McClellan, and Alex Moreschi. Gentlemen, thank you so much. I don't know how to take that. Like, it feels kind of like I got to agree with Seamus that the question wasn't necessarily answered in the end. The question of what can Christian morality do that secular morality can't do anyway? That didn't seem.
It's a lot like the Hitchens question, right?
Yeah,
the Hitchens question that what good works can only be done under the guise of religion as opposed to secularity, right? It's kind of the same kind of question.
Well, I think it comes back to the point of to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. If you believe that as a statement that you're going to stand in judgment one day for the things that you've done and or not done. And so I live my life with that belief and understanding that everything that I do now impacts my eternity. So that is a huge overarching issue for me in the way that I live my life.
Right. It seems.
And my response to the Hitchens question would just be, well, none, right? There isn't something that a religious person could do that a secular person couldn't. Right. But that's not an issue for me. Right. I simply don't care about the question.
At the end of the day, it seems like even though Alex and Nick seem to disagree on more than the atheists disagreed with the Christians.
Yeah, it seems that way.
That was an interesting.
Wasn't expecting a 3-on-1. And then me being the most ignorant one in the group, that didn't help either.
No, not at all. You certainly didn't sound that way. But the question is answered in the sense of if you believe in God, the Christian God, then Christian morality would be superior. However, its significance is just based on whether or not God exists. If God doesn't exist, then it doesn't appear to be superior. But if he does...
Or rather, it's not whether or not God exists, it's whether or not the person that is within that believes that God exists, right?
Yes, that's fair.
You lost me on that.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry.
Well, I think that was in terms to his own subjective morality, not in the morality, the absolute and objective morality that you were referencing, Nick. Yeah,
I want to argue that the subjective one's probably the only one that matters, and maybe the only one that really exists. Like the monolith of objective morality, I think you can get to a good general heuristic of saying, yeah, murder's wrong, but I don't think I agree at all that where is that ledger that murder is wrong? We had to arrive at that. We had to learn that. And that was a subjective experience. I just don't think morality is objective. I think not in that way, not like somewhere out there it just has to be so. I just don't see that.
Right. See, and I think that's where I might
disagreement.
I think I would probably disagree with Joshua here, and as you know, in the same sense of like the two atheists would start arguing, kind of like the two Christians were arguing, kind of thing. I do believe in objective morality. I think of it a lot like truth, like it does exist whether we're aware of it or not.
However, that's interesting.
There is truth, and he has a name.
Oh, Robert,
Jesus.
I want to pick your brain on that one.
Can we save?
I'm more in line with Joshua.
That's amazing. That is absolutely amazing. Can we save objective morality for next time? I'd love to get you guys back together again.
Yeah, I'd love to talk with any of these folks, but Alex, I'd be totally down to get together on the subjective objective thing. I think really at the heart of it is a language issue, because I do think rape is wrong, and I think murder is wrong. But I don't think that, that belief is rooted in objective facts the way that my belief that 2 and 2 make 4 are.
Yeah.
And I think
I guess for me, what I would say is that I think for me it is rooted in the objective fact, although fact is the wrong word, the objective truth that loving your neighbor is the best way to live one's life. And so if that is the guidepost, well, then murder and these sorts of things would all follow. But not from the reverse.
But Alex, I don't see a difference in what you're stating than what they're stating, as far as what you just stated doesn't need God.
Right. Well,
my opinion, it absolutely has to come from God, because there has to be an absolute truth for anything to make sense.
Well, I believe that. So for me, right, and this is for me, I believe that it needs God in the sense that God is in that love, right? That without the presence of God, love falls apart. But that's, there are all sorts of problems with that argument.
People say I love peanut butter, but that doesn't equate.
No, that's not where I was going. I was going more from a patronizing standpoint and that kind of thing with, all of that. But that's my sort of my personal understanding is that for me, God is in all of those acts of love. And so the foundation for love then, again, not from a metaphysical sense, not from a codified legal perspective, but rather in my perspective and thinking. In other words, I'm not trying to say that because the atheists don't have God, they can't love. I don't think that's true.
Mm-hmm. You just think that love essentially comes from God. And I think
God is love.
Okay.
God is love. We agree.
Fair enough. Hey, at least we got those guys to agree. And then the atheists in the end disagree. But
you got two Christians to agree on something. I don't know. That's pretty good, Robert.
Alex, do you believe there's an absolute truth?
Maybe.
we gotta save that for next time, gentlemen. Thank you so much.
Wow.
I really enjoyed this.
I appreciate the fact that even though we don't agree, you guys were so cordial and you didn't character assassinate Alex and I. And I greatly appreciate that from the bottom of my heart. I really do.
It would have been wrong to do so, sir. You're a fine gentleman.
Well,
Absolutely.
I appreciate that, and you guys impress me with your intellect. And if I can ever be a part of a lower standing conversation, I'm all up for it.
All right.
Thanks again, guys.
Much love to you guys. Stay safe.
was a lot of fun.
Thanks,
Same
y'all.
here.
Yeah,
Same here.
likewise.
Thank you to Seamus, Nick, Joshua, and Alex. Thank you to Dave Blair at DaveBlairMusic.com. Thank you to our patrons: Alan Marks, Bernard Lamberell, Enema Man, Freethinker 215, Larry Wilson, Patrick Walsh, Tara, Phil Calderon, Philip Spahn, Gregoria, Kelly Clemenson, and Rob Montgomery. You can support this broadcast at patreon.com/right and learn more at therighttoreason.com. Next week, I am discussing how prehistoric cave art explains the afterlife with naturalist, archaeoastronomer, and author Bernie Taylor. Between now and then, remember that you have the right to reason.